to make some announcements. And the first announcement is, first of all, thank you all very much for your contributions, which have made this conference really, really interesting, and I thoroughly enjoyed being able to take part in it. I was probably, I was at every single session, so I can honestly say it was really, really enriching. I also wanted to say, if you want to try out your papers a little bit more, you can do that very easily by basically writing a blog for Critical Studies in Television Online. Kim is here. She's the best person to contact in that regard. But we can also, if you want to get in touch with me, I'm one of the editors for the blog as well. So very happy for you to email me with a blog, usually around 1,000 to 2,000 words long. So if you just want to basically play out those ideas that you've developed here further, it would be lovely to hear from you. The blog starts back in September, so we will be asking for contributions around that time anyway. But if you want to write something over summer, please do so. I'm also very, very happy to say that we can announce the dates for next year's conference. Next year's conference will be in person at Edge Hill University on campus. They will also provide the accommodation, because unfortunately Omskirk is so small that we don't have enough hotel accommodation there. But that means that actually your accommodation will be relatively cheap as well. The thing about so the dates for the conference will be the 5th to the 7th of July. Finally, I also wanted to encourage you to vote, or to be precise, to nominate your favorite outlier of television. We are, as the Television Studies Research Group at Edge Hill University, we're running an annual event, which is the Critical Awards in Television Studies, which celebrates television from a different angle than we normally do. And we are always trying to highlight things that are important to us as an area of study. Last year, we were celebrating, for example, the fact that television gave us comfort during COVID, but also that production managers were really important, keeping their staff and crew safe. So if you would like to nominate your favorite outlier of television, please either join Vivox app with that number, or what you can do right now, use your mobile phone, scan the QR code, and that takes you straight to the nomination page. You will have to click the clipboard at the top so that you can put the information in, but hopefully it'll all be very straightforward, and all you have to do is submit at the end. Right, I think that was all of the announcement I had. So I'm going to send this picture out later in a thank you message as well, by the way, so you can do that later as well. But now I'm handing over to Brett, who's chairing the final session, which is a roundtable on television studies. So I hand over.
Thank you, Elke. Yeah, and welcome to this final session for this conference, a roundtable. And I'll just quickly note all the people who are in this roundtable. So we've got Josette Wolthuis, Kim Akass, Christine Geraghty, Rachel Moseley, and Amy Holdsworth. Everybody wave. That's good. But also, we kind of want to note from the outset, the aim of this is to be a very kind of open discussion space, the kind of idea you want at a conference, at the end of a conference, where everybody can come together and chat and discuss. So while we have people who are going to start off the conversation, I'm inviting everybody else to please be involved as much as possible. And in the spirit of that, if anybody's able or willing to put their camera on so we can all see each other at this stage, that would be really, really good as well, but also later on at other points. I don't have a PowerPoint or anything, but I do kind of want to introduce what this session is about. So I'm going to be sticking stuff in the chat. If that's going to work. Yes, it is. And the title of this session is called When Philosophy Invented TV Studies. And I then kind of thought about it actually in relationship to, I'm enjoying people's faces, connected to obviously the theme of this conference, the outliers of television studies, and actually starting to wondering whether television studies itself is an outlier in some contexts and some circumstances, which is what we want to talk about. I'm just briefly going to outline where this has come from. And this came from a special edition of a journal that was published earlier this year. And let me stick that info in the chat, which was a special edition of the journal Open Philosophy, which was dedicated to the discussion of television. And so a number of chapters and pieces there. And the introduction to that outline, well, I've quoted there from that where it says, TV studies are gaining increasing attention in current research. We will be pleased to know. However, their aesthetic potential for visualizing ethical issues and facilitating collective inquiry into democratic values has not yet been fully appreciated, says a journal article in 2022. This got picked up by some people on Twitter, television studies colleagues who are kind of quite angry about it. And Rachel and I and Amy and Lawrence Napper got together and had a rant for the morning about it and thought, what can we do about this? This kind of keeps happening, this idea that it feels as if we don't exist. And from that came the idea of kind of having this session to think this through. So there's three things that we're going to kind of aim to do today, which is firstly to kind of deal with this question of what is our experience of this, of kind of encountering this idea that television doesn't exist, or people from other subject areas just wandering into television and talking about it as if there isn't decades worth of work that already exists. Secondly, to think about why that might be. And then thirdly, to try and get something productive and useful out of this, what can we do next? And so I think we're assuming we might start off a bit ranty and angry and frustrated here, but actually I think a conference can be a useful place for that, for us to collectively come together and say, actually, here's our frustrations, and is everyone encountering the same? But across the session, hopefully move towards the idea of kind of, okay, so what do we do next? Does something kind of come out of this? So that's the structure. So I'm going to start off with this first question to everybody on the panel, but I'll also invite, obviously, those of you who are not on the panel, if you want to put stuff in the chat, if you want to put your hand up and contribute, then please do as well, and I'll try and kind of manage all of that and bring all of that stuff in, because it would be really good to hear everybody's experiences. So that first question, where, if at all, because it may be the case that some people haven't experienced this, have experienced people engaging analytically with TV but failing to be aware of the existence of TV studies, and obviously this is connected to the journal there. And can I go first of all then to Rachel, being as we started off with this conversation? Go, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. So I'll just kind of start answering that by talking about how I responded when my colleague Richard Dillon, who's in the room, drew my attention to this issue earlier this year. And my immediate reaction was really quite violent and enraged. And that was before I'd even read it, which I did have to kind of check myself a little bit. And so then read the opening article, got more enraged, partly because of one of quotes like the one that Brett's put in the chat. And over time I've continued to reflect on why I was so angered by the appearance of this issue. And even now, having read all of the articles in the kind of dossier, I still feel really angry about it, and it's because it's kind of poked at a sore spot, right? So it's poked at a sore spot, which is about the ease with which academic disciplines which are higher in the hierarchy, the ranking, intellectual ranking, like literature, like film studies, like philosophy, are able to simply pick up and assume that a popular medium has not been taken seriously until it's been discovered by that discipline, which is of higher value. And that's really, I suppose this isn't the first time I've seen it. So a really good example of when I felt like this before has been when suddenly scholars in film studies, colleagues, and in literature decide that television is worth thinking about because something like The Wire appears and suddenly has lots of kind of critical appreciation, and it's contemporary, it's American, it's of a particular gendered address, quite often the television that inspires people to think that television might be worth looking at in a way that it hasn't been before. And then there's the issue of kind of streamed media and the fact that ordinary live broadcast television isn't perceived. I mean, this issue in itself, with the exception of one piece, is almost entirely about contemporary television and the lack of historicity in terms of not just the texts which are being looked at, but also lack of historicity in relation to the discipline. I won't name the article, but there is one article that talks about the direct address of a programme as a gimmick, which kind of doesn't recognise the kind of the medium specificity of the programming. So my anger has come from a context in which this keeps happening and in which television studies and all the work that has gone before remains invisible. So one of the things that I'd really love to come out of this conversation today, probably led by people who are less ranty than I'm feeling about this, is what do we do to get that European Research Council funding that this comes from, to make ourselves less invisible, to have the confidence. I mean, I have to say, I would not proceed to write a piece on philosophy and television without doing a Google Scholar search to check what was already there, and neither would my undergraduate students, I have to say, and that's my concern. So that's my bit of ranting. I have got more positive things to say as well, but I'm going to save them until somebody else has had a go. Thanks, Brett.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Well, that's nice to know. I didn't know that context, that the research that led to this publication that has an ERC grant. So this is funded research that is. So it says something about funding bodies as well, and the kind of rigor of those funding bodies too. Christine, can I come to you as you know, one of the foundational people in the subject area? It'd be interesting to hear what you have to say on it. That apparently the subject you invented it here.
I'm not sure the weight of history is entirely helpful for positive views, but we might as well start with a bit of history. And I wouldn't normally do this, but this is Women and Soap Opera, okay, 1991. And I just wanted to read a couple of sentences. The very repetition of soap opera plots allows them to offer a paradigm of emotional relationships in which only one element needs to be changed for the effect to be different. Soaps offer a continually shifting kaleidoscope of emotional relationships which allow the audience to test out how particular emotional variations can or should be handled. And when I wrote that in 1991, I was referring back to my own work in 1981 on Coronation Street, but also to Charlotte Brunston's absolutely seminal piece, which would be found if somebody Googled for it, in which she said Crossroads, which was also a soap opera, is in the business not of creating narrative excitement, suspense, delay and resolution, but of constructing moral consensus about the conduct of personal life. So unlike Rachel, actually, I was just rather baffled, and my breath got taken away when I went on to read that, according to Open Philosophy, TV series provide common reference points which populate ordinary conversations and political debates. They become shared representations of moral reasoning and feelings. they arouse ethical reflection in their viewers, which is a more or less direct quote, actually, if they only knew it, from Geraghty and Bronson. But this is, of course, in the spirit of philosophy, and I absolutely concur with Rachel about, I mean, I, at Glasgow, lived with the philosophy department that was established 550 years ago, didn't we, Amy? And boy, don't we know it, you know. So definitely, it is astonishing, actually. I was going to say something about French academic studies, but I don't think I will. Just a couple of more points then. Firstly, absolutely, I do think the different histories of film and television studies and their sort of bifurcation is significant in this respect. I worked in film and television studies departments. So, and I have worked myself across film and television studies, but there's no doubt there is a difficulty of incorporating television studies into journals, into conferences, into subject associations, the creation of BAFTs, into departments, into schools, into, you know, Faculty of Arts, etc. And again, that notion of working on the contemporary is also very important there. People always assume that somehow we were dealing with contemporary television rather than with the histories of. So I do think there is something there around film studies which is worth discussing. And I will say, in comparison, my move into adaptation studies, which I did in the kind of mid-2000s, they were much more welcoming, much easier to take television studies there as well as film. And obviously I worked to establish what was happening in adaptation studies, but going to their conferences, there was no problem about doing television. There were other people interested in television, and that expanded into adaptation studies has changed very considerably in the last 20 years, and I think perhaps I was lucky there. But I think it's a striking comparison, the difference. The final thing, which perhaps needs to be thought about, is television studies has traditionally, or television has traditionally been studied in its national context. And I think that's been really important because of its civic functions, the way in which indeed it provides ethical questions for viewers. Its funding, its models of funding, PSB versus, you know, unfettered capitalism. And I think that there was a freedom in television studies in being able to study the stories that were being told in your own nation, and actually being able to ignore US television to some extent in a way which wasn't possible in film studies. And certainly, you know, probably wrongly, I took British television as being my subject and stuck with it. Now, definitely, and this is one of the things we might discuss later on, there is a shift away from that now, and that's important. So I do think that crossing national boundaries is an important way of promoting television studies and being friendly to the French, perhaps, as long as that is not just studying Netflix and the various ways in which US corporations plan to take over the screen for the rest of us. But nevertheless, I think that's something that I haven't really done, and I think that's an important element. I mean, in our discussions, we might want to constitute whether television studies exists as a discipline, and if so, what features it has. But I think I'll just leave that there for the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. That's lots of useful stuff to think about. Josie, can I come to you? Because Christine then talked about kind of national context, and I'm right, you're currently based at Amsterdam. So it'd be interesting to hear about, is this a British thing? Are we coming to it from a British perspective? Where else does this sit? What's your perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Brett. So I'm a lecturer on a temporary contract in the Netherlands. I'm actually, my contract with the University of Amsterdam is ending, so I'm starting another temporary contract with Radboud University in Nijmegen. And I did think it would be useful to touch upon the institutional question, and especially sort of in affiliations and where we belong in sort of academia, because it is indeed a question that's bugged me as well in the Dutch context. So to clarify, so I did my PhD in a film and television studies department at the University of Warwick, but there is no department in the Netherlands that has television in its name. So that's been tricky already. So in Amsterdam, I worked in a media studies department, and I was in a television and cross-media team, but that's kind of an internal thing. You can't really see that from the outside because it was part of a media and culture bachelor's program. It does have an MA, but it's pretty small. And everything's kind of been consumed into media and culture. Something similar happens in the other universities in the Netherlands, where at Utrecht University, you've got a media and cultural studies department, which offers media and culture as a bachelor's. And it has a film and TV studies MA, but it's also, again, quite small and mostly offered in Dutch. I think they're starting in English next year. And something similar is in the other Dutch universities that offer this kind of program. They're all called Art, Culture and Media, Media and Culture Studies. There are some departments that have then a film team and film tracks, which are much better profiled than television. Because film is usually called film, but when there's television on offer, it's called media or cross media or audiovisual media or contemporary media. So there's nothing really. Television in a name somewhere isn't that common to find. So that's always been my issue as well. Like, what kind of department do I belong in? I worked also in a journalism and media department at the University of Groningen in the north of the Netherlands, where it's always been a question, like, they have an art, culture and media department, which has a film team, and then they have a journalism and media department. And the question of where television belongs has always been really funny there. And recently the film team started expressing interest in having people on their team that do study TV, even though most of them work in the journalism department. So it's kind of strange. I was thinking here as well, I heard Elke say something earlier during one of the other panels that struck with me. Elke was mentioning that it's sometimes hard to convince students to take the TV track rather than a film track. Is that right? So it was in one of the other panels. Currently in my program at the University of Amsterdam, in the second year, the media and culture students can choose whether they want to focus on film or on television. And pretty much all of my students kind of gravitate towards film. And then I asked them about their reasons for doing so. And quite often they don't know that the stuff that they want to analyze in film, that you can also analyze that in TV. Plus that the career perspectives that they're actually interested in are mostly to be found in the TV world, and that way fewer jobs are available in those fields in film. So I end up actually convincing quite a lot of students to take the TV track after all, but it takes some talking to them. So I found that really interesting. And I guess finally, I organized a conference last year as well, which you, Brett, were part of as well. And again, if you look at everyone's institutional affiliations of this conference, it strikes me that we're from all such different departments. We all have such different institutional affiliations. So I guess I want to bring that up in the sense of, where do we belong? I am not film enough to belong to film, but I'm also not cross-media enough to belong to cross-media. And there are a few places that actually have television in their name. So yeah, I guess I would bring that up for discussion.
Okay, there's loads of really, really useful stuff there. Thank you. That's good to know about and to get that context. This first question then, Kim, can I come to you? Have you experienced all of this as well?
Oh, over the years, I mean, I've been working in television for the last 20 years. So we come across it time and time again. For the journal, Critical Studies in Television, you'd be surprised at how many people send in articles that seem like they've just discovered television and don't even quote TV in it and quote no scholars. And I have to really hold myself back because I could give really scathing reviews to those, and I don't. But that's the thing that enrages me. If you're going to write for a television studies journal, at least include some television studies articles would be a good start. The problem I have, and I've had for years and years, is institutional bias against TV studies. And I'm currently in America. Well, I'm not now. I'm in the UK now, but I'm working in America because, you know, my field is American TV, and it's been really eye-opening. I did think that because I was going to America to start a new television studies master's, that people would be interested. But I found myself in a kind of argument with the dean about why should this be called Television Studies Masters? Well, because it is television studies. But they really focused on, well, people don't watch TV on TV anymore. It should be something else because you watch it on screens and you watch. So this argument went on for, I would say, backwards and forwards for about a year. You know, why do we call it television studies when people watch TV on a phone? And so I had to dig out quotes from people to say it's not about the actual physical thing. It doesn't matter where you watch it. It's about the form. This is, you know, a form that has evolved over the years. I then found my dean didn't have a TV for the first 13 years of his child's life because he doesn't agree with TV. So, you know, go figure. You can see it's the same in America as everywhere else. They want to make us communications or mass communications or media and mass communications, but never television. So, you know, I'm trying not to get enraged as I talk about it. My last job, I was in creative arts. I'm working in creative arts. So, and there's always the privileging of arts. And so for the last ref, my associate dean of research told me that my articles were just a bit descriptive. And, you know, it really, I don't think it'll even get into ref, even though it was in continuum. So I'm obviously still smarting from that. And it's just this overall feeling that TV isn't important and it's not something that should be studied. Whereas I think it is the most important thing to study, especially with the explosion of TV. We can't just take it that, you know, this is innocent. We all know it isn't innocent and it needs to be studied and discussed. And, you know, as Christine says, put it into the national, or was it whoever said this, put it into the national institutional landscape. It makes such a huge difference. You know what, and we know this, watching American TV isn't the TV that I've been studying and writing about. You know about how different it is. You know, and I'm sure it's true everywhere. You know, everywhere's got their own local TV but that is being absolutely, you know, subsumed under American television, which is just so wrong. You know, there's so much that I love about the BBC, Comfort TV. I just love it. Probably one of the reasons that I'll be coming back quite soon is because I miss the BBC so much. So I won't rant too much, but that's kind of where I'm coming up from is, you know, 20 years of being discriminated against. Also, just one thing I would say is being a feminist working in TV studies, you know, that's like the biggest no-no of all, I think. You know, people really don't respond well to feminist TV studies just in an academic institution. So, you know, poor cousin. That's it. That's all I'm going to say for now.
Okay, thanks, Kim. That wasn't too ranty.
I'm holding it back.
No, so I don't think we should. We can have a spec, but anyway. And it's great to hear from you and from Josie as well to hear those kind of other contexts. And say I had wondered, is this a UK thing? But it sounds like kind of that it isn't. Amy, I'll come to you then. What's your experience of all of this?
Yeah, I was thinking about your question, and because I'm a big fan of interdisciplinary approaches, and you know, I know from your work, Brett, on kind of animal studies as well, it can be really rich in bringing other disciplines to television studies. And I have to admit that I don't read as much television studies as I should, because I'm always seduced by other areas. And I was just thinking about a paper I gave at Screen the other weekend, you know, that was using anthropology, sociology, medical humanities, disability studies, philosophy, you know, in order, and for me, you need all those other disciplines in order to be able to think about television, because it is so complex and interesting and rich and diverse. But I was thinking also about where I've encountered writing about television in other fields, particularly when I've been doing research around things like eating on television, you know, so there's a lot of social sciences, health sciences stuff about the problem of television when it comes to kind of healthy eating. You also find television written about in terms of representation. So I've encountered this in kind of work that thinks about representations of disability or representations of mental health, where you'll get psychiatrists, for example, just having a little side project, writing an essay on where we see psychiatrists on television and why the representation is always bad. And I think that's something that's, again, is not unique to television. You'll get that people writing about these kind of things in film, using film examples or literature examples in order to write about kind of popular representations of something or other. And I think that's why I think Elka's comment in the chat about film study scholars should know better, because they're also moaning about that as well. So I think it's interesting to see where we see it outside of the arts and humanities as well, where television gets written about, often in not very good ways. You know, I sit on a few editorial boards for journals outside of TV studies, and I always get sent the essays that use television. And like Kim is saying, I'm always having to say, you actually need to do some research into television studies before you sort of go ahead with this. So I think the other thing that I was just thinking about when Christine and the others were talking as well, and I don't know whether Rachel remembers this, but I remember a meeting of the Midlands TV Research Group where Charlotte distinguished between people who do television studies and people who write about television. I can't remember if that was the exact difference, but I thought that was always something that stuck in my head, and trying to work out whether I was someone who did television studies or whether I was just someone who wrote about television. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say for now.
Okay, that's great, thanks. And it's great you raised the issue of interdisciplinarity, because as I was preparing for this session today, I was kind of thinking, I was getting worried. I was kind of thinking, am I being too proprietorial here? I'm going, we own television studies and nobody else is allowed to talk about it. And how much do you want to construct boundaries around a subject area and say there are rules and you must be like us? Whereas, yeah, I think my experience is lots of interdisciplinarity. But the interesting thing, and the example you gave then of the work I'm currently doing in animal studies, as soon as I started doing that, I had a panic of, I've got to read loads of zoology. This is what I sort of find interesting, that my immediate thought process was, I'm not one of those people, but I need to go and know what the literature is. But it seems the other way around, that doesn't happen. People don't go. And I'm wondering if that's because, obviously, I know zoology exists. So therefore, I know there must be some literature somewhere. And there's something about a lack of awareness of the existence of this material that means people aren't even thinking, oh, I should probably go and look at this stuff. But then that's even weirder within our institutions when we have colleagues from other departments who do that, when they know we exist because we sit in meetings with them. I was going to ask, because I think it's a really interesting question, if we can see there that Joseph Oldham in the chat has put. I'm curious as to how many of us publish on television topics in journals that lie firmly outside of television studies and what our experience of that is. And that seems to me a really interesting question, because it says something about the expectations of us, but also kind of validity, whether we've kind of encountered, we can't publish this because it's about telly and this is a proper journal that doesn't talk about television. I don't know, does anyone kind of want to respond to that? Rachel, how about you?
I'm just trying to think about whether I have, and I have. Well, I mean, I've published in Continuum, for example, and I've published in journals with broad remit that would accept television as part of kind of the arts and culture that they deal with. It's never been problematic. I think one of my questions, and it comes back to what Amy was just saying about being a peer reviewer, is the journal issue that we're talking about came out very quickly. If you look at the kind of date of submission of articles and kind of then when it was published. And, you know, Amy's just spoken about being the person on journal boards who is given the television related material to look at. There wasn't a sense for me that process had happened in quite that way, but I don't know, so I can't be sure. But yeah, I don't know. Christine's got her hand up though.
Yeah, Christine.
Well, I was just going back to Josie's admirable description of the list of department titles and what have you. I mean, I think I would say that one of the signs of television studies as a discipline is a very wide-ranging set of approaches, due in part, at least, to its origins in cultural studies or its connections to cultural studies, which are very strong. So that if you were thinking about what kind of discipline we were, I would say that it would have a number of recognized methods and approaches, which would include anthropological, sociological, could include philosophical, does include, you know, literary adaptation type stuff. And none of those things would be problematic in terms of submitting work based on that. I mean, one of the pleasures I had at Goldsmiths was supervising students who were doing work on audiences, interviewing people and what have you. I'd never done that, but it didn't matter. They got their PhDs and it was very enriching for me. So I think that there's two things. One is that what we feel about being inside that media communications cultural studies grouping, which is what the film studies people objected to. They want to be called film studies, as somebody said. Now, what does television studies think about being in a larger grouping around cultural studies? I think it's quite a complicated issue, and maybe part of the problem of invisibility, as indeed Josie and others have been discussing.
I mean, that usefully leads on, we're kind of talking about it already, but the second kind of question that I was going to ask, which is this one: why might it be that those in other fields seemingly are unaware of TV studies' existence and don't appear to check whether there is existing work on TV before doing their own? We've talked about some kind of organized, institutional structures, but as I say, I mean, I've experienced this. The university I used to work at, colleagues in American studies who just suddenly started writing about television. And, they knew that there were colleagues on the floor above who did television studies, but there was no kind of, discussion about that kind of stuff. So I don't know, why might this be that people don't think this is kind of worth checking on? What might this tell us? Amy's doing a thinking face, so I'm going to Amy.
I was just thinking about something that happened at Glasgow just before the pandemic. There was a big event being planned around Outlander, and it was being led by people in Scottish literature. And it wasn't until I think my colleague Lisa Kelly got involved that she actually had to sort of sit them down and tell them that the things that they were talking about, this was actually a television program. I know it was it's obviously adapted from a series of novels, but everything that they were talking about, it seemed to be completely invisible to them, the fact that this was a television program that they were thinking about. And Lisa had to push them to begin to actually engage with people in our part of the university in order to sort of recognize that. But it really, I found it really bizarre, because it's like it's just, you're not seeing it. It seems to be completely invisible that this is a different kind of cultural object. So that doesn't answer your question. That's just another example of where it happens. Yeah. Okay,
thank you. I'll come to Elka because you've got your hand up. Christine, your hand's up. Is that a legacy hand? Can I just check? Okay, that's all right. I'll come to Elka then, because I think your hand was up from before, Christine.
Yeah, no, this is a hand that's come up as a result of that question that you put in the chat, because I had the experience of so I put in the chat that they had an experience of reading a blog about televisuality that didn't refer to John T. Caldwell's work, which, you know, how can you not? And I ended up having a long conversation with one of my colleagues about how it is perfectly acceptable for a film scholar to write about television without consulting television studies, because it's important to look at television from other perspectives. And it baffled me. It totally baffled me. I couldn't respond to it anymore, basically. But that poses the question of, why do we perhaps always feel we need to engage with all those other subject areas that we're engaging with? Why do we not just turn around and go, well, I'm doing television studies, why don't I just take a television studies approach and don't worry about animal studies or things like that?
And you, Elke, can I check, are you meaning that in a devil's advocate provocative way, or do you actually genuinely think that could be a legitimate thing to do?
I am not sure. I'm not sure, to be honest. It's partially devil's advocate, but where does this need in ourselves come from, that we feel we need to, if we engage with another discipline, we need to engage with that discipline? Why don't, so if, you know, I wrote a book, I wrote an article about masculinity, and I felt really, really strongly that I needed to engage with as much as I could in masculinity studies, which is such a big area, you can't, basically. But I read everything, and that ended up me not having the space to talk about what has been written about masculinity in television studies. So I kind of had only 2 sentences to summarize that, because I just didn't have the space. Why do we feel we need to read everything in the other area when there is an area in our field already existing? Where does that come from as well?
Okay, I'll come to Kim, who had a hand up first, and then I'll come to Amy.
Sorry, multitasking. I'm trying to unmute and lower my hand. I think I've done both. I just wanted to say something I wanted to say at the beginning that was really occurred to me this morning is we have got 50 years, over 50 years worth of TV studies work, really good work out there. You know, just recently I've had to go back to, you know, Christine's work, you know, early cultural studies, and it occurs to me that there is already such a canon of work that it's like TV. You just can't keep up with it all. So why are people not actually engaging with that? And I kind of tend to agree with Elke, you know, why do we actually feel that we have to engage with other work? And I think it's partly because, you know, I come from film, you know, most of us kind of come from other places and have moved across. And, you know, initially I did, and I still sometimes use film theory, but I don't need to. You know, there is enough work there that actually, you know, and it doesn't, I don't mean to be arrogant, it's like, but I have read it but forgotten about it, and that's not arrogant, is it? That's just having a bad memory as an old person. But, you know, it's like I've kind of forgotten more than the people in film and philosophy have even learned. So, you know, I just think we really should treasure that canon and work within it. But and then if we move outside of it, great. You know, then we can start to bring in masculinity studies and animals and you know, whatever else we're doing. But I think it should be TV studies first and foremost, just because there's such a wealth of stuff out there. I just want to say one thing that I remember when we first, because Janet and I started the journal out of a conference, and we had Mark Lawson in to talk at it, and then he wrote something for us. And in that piece, he says that he worked with a TV critic, a journalist, who boasted that he didn't even have a TV. So, and I think that is just, you know, we're still dogged with that kind of arrogance that, you know, you don't even have to engage with TV. You know, you can just dip into it, and that's good enough. And I can feel my rage rising again. So, you know, over to somebody else. Yeah.
It's funny thinking about that, because I think sometimes, and maybe this was earlier in my career, I kind of liked the marginal, invisible status. It made me feel like cool and radical because like I'm not established. But yeah, then you encounter a whole series of kind of organizational structures that treat you as that, and you suddenly go, oh, this isn't fun, this is just disempowering. But it's I don't know, for me it's also a bit weird because there's something I like about the lack of establishment nature of television studies, that it doesn't sit like literature and philosophy, it sits somewhere else. However, as we're all saying, that leads to a whole set of problems as well. And for me, I'm trying to find a way to negotiate that. Sorry, Amy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, that sort of the sort of coolness of it. I mean, we are all desperately cool, I should say. I think it's really important to look outside of TV study, to obviously base everything, ground it in the discipline, but to look outside of it as well, so things don't become too insular. But I do wonder about some of the really quite bombastic claims of the open philosophy journals, of and there was one that Josie circulated recently, and the pressures that from things like REF, applying for big European grants to make these big claims that you are, carving out a new field, that this is the most innovative, original, amazing work ever, that it's world leading, that there is that pressure to kind of for people to make these quite grandiose claims about what they're doing. Obviously, I think it's also based on a lack of rigor and and probably snobbery, but I do worry about that, because you do sometimes see in writing, the ref paragraph where someone's kind of basically sort of saying, in this 4-star piece of research, I will, cure cancer via television studies, sort of thing. So I think some of those institutional pressures might also be behind the kind of big claims that people make. Maybe that's too generous of me, I don't know.
No, I think that sounds kind of convincing. There is this way in which we have to talk. You're right. Josie, you put in the chat about fields not having high status and being perceived as trivial. Do you want to talk through that a bit, connected to this, please?
Yeah, of course. So far, I guess we've been saying that, television studies does not have a high status, if you will, and then compared to maybe other fields that do. But my problem is I bring together costume and fashion studies with TV, and both are seen as trivial. So this has been my issue when I try to bring together two fields that have been seen as not very important, not very trivial, not very high status. So to me, they are equal. But yeah, this kind of raises all sorts of other issues. I don't really have the answers to this. But yeah, so what to do when one of them doesn't have a clearly much higher status?
Yeah, I'm not sure. And I'm wondering, does this connect to, again in the chat, Catherine Helen Bengus has put a good point about the invisibility of TV. Couldn't it also be the strategy to keep the legitimacy of one's own field and not dirtying it with thinking of perceived trivial commercial medium television? Catherine, are you there? Can you talk to this a bit?
Yes, I'm here.
Cool.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this point of invisibility of television, and I guess in what Amy was saying, it came from simply not thinking about the fact that this is a television show that has televisual properties. But at least in the works that I've encountered that engage with television, they deliberately focus on only the televisual text, kind of shedding the medium and thereby also the commerciality that comes with it. I'm here speaking of a non-Anglo-American sphere, which I guess also, I think in British and US Academy, the commerciality of television is not as dirty as it is in other places. I mean, I'm thinking of France and Germany here, for example. So that this may also be not only that it's not considered relevant, but also that it's considered as not adding to the point, because what we really want to talk about is this beautiful philosophical reflection that this TV show is offering, not the fact that it's commercially funded particularly, which is weird because everyone it seems, is so interested in American, fully commercialized, globalized shows. But that's what I meant with that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the idea of the text is kind of interesting because I'm thinking about audience studies and audience research here, and colleagues in fan studies who have the same complaints that we do, that at every fan studies conference somebody turns up and insists they've invented fan studies. So I suppose we should know, I guess it's not just us, it happens to, there's a whole series of fields where people are going, oh, somebody reckons they've just invented it. Christine, you put your hand up then.
Well, it just occurred to me, I have worked on television with French scholars very productively, Shannon Wells-Lassagne and others, and we ended up publishing a little dossier in Screen, and Shannon has written extensively about television. Now that, I think it links up with Catherine's point, that was because we were coming at it via adaptation, and that gave it a kind of, I think in their institutions, it gave it a kind of credibility that if they'd said to their dean, we're going to work on television, it wouldn't quite have had. So I do very much endorse Catherine's point about that there's something about television, which is why we started working on it after all, that is a bit grubby and, you know, and populist. So an adaptation makes it sound, you know, cleaner.
Okay, 10 minutes ago, Amy said we were cool. You're now saying we're grubby. This has gone downhill quite quickly. But before I come to Josie, who's put her hand up, what's your view, Christine Beans? You've said that in response to that. Because I can see that's a very pragmatic response. Let's latch ourselves onto legitimate things. But should we do that, or should we just kind of stand up for ourselves and say, actually, there's legitimacy within this? What?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because of course in adaptation studies I also had a bit of a fight around there was a fight going on against English literature, which had dominated adaptation studies. So it was a really interesting terrain in a way. But I think if perhaps a bit like Kim says, if we acknowledge television studies as our home when we went elsewhere, are there ways of doing that? So if you're, you know, writing for animal studies, you make a point of referring back to television studies as a method. Mm-hmm. You know, if we talked more about the very wide-ranging methods in television studies and didn't ascribe them all the time to anthropology or sociology or literature or whatever, these are ours. We have a history of working in television studies, you know, in those ways. And perhaps if we were prouder of that and referred to it briefly, you don't need endless references, but just knew that if you're doing work on, you know, if students are interviewing people for their PhD, there's a whole load of people who've interviewed people in television studies in productive ways. And maybe we need to think a bit more about what is television studies to us and articulate that very briefly in our work. Like other people don't need to do that in a way, they just are, but we need to show and tell.
Okay, yeah, and that, as Rachel's just put in the chat, assuming a confident posture. I like how you put, as the philosophers do. Is this a particular way of walking we need to adopt or something? Is this what it is? Josie, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just mostly referring back to Christine's point about using adaptation studies. I guess I don't want to say as legitimization of why to do TV, but it sounds better in some way. I find it interesting that when we talk about these philosophy proposals and publications, they're really interested in mostly really recent high-end TV. If I think to the Dutch context though, and like Dutch television studies, that comes mostly from an interest in history. So Dutch television's got a really interesting link to sociocultural history, which I won't go into now. But I think as a result, it's mostly studied by historians rather than by people interested in current and contemporary TV. So whereas I guess most of the stuff that we see around now is about contemporary TV, or the stuff that's hot and new right now on HBO, it's not really the case here. It's mostly historians that really look at Dutch TV. or people interested in reality TV from about the 2000s onwards. So it's not really the case that in all national context, it's just an interest in contemporary TV. I find that, for example, in my national context, it's mostly historians that would be looking at TV and or using history as a justification for studying TV.
And what's your sense, Josie, how that's read, I don't know, in a history department? Is that understood as kind of as legitimate thing to do as history as, I don't know, the history of wars and blah, 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 you know, in inverted commas, proper history? Do you know how those historians are read?
I'm not entirely sure because, of course, I've not worked in a history department and I've also not studied history separately. But I do know it tends to be taken up more as general sort of media history. So you learn about radio, then you learn about television, etc. I just think that most people that classify themselves as television scholars in the Netherlands are television historians, if that makes sense. And it's, I guess, that's a more common context in which to study television.
Mm-hmm. But again, it's interesting because we're repeatedly talking about connecting to legitimate fields, which can be really useful in terms of interdisciplinarity. So that's a good thing. But what does that kind of mean for us? Amy?
I do wonder about film philosophy as an area, and I don't know very much about it, but I know there's some tensions between film studies and film philosophy. And I do wonder if some of the interest in television is coming via film philosophy as a sort of desire to go, oh, well, we've done film, we've done Deleuze and film now, what can we do Deleuze and next? So a kind of like, well, we can now create this field called television philosophy. So it'd be interesting to think a bit more about if philosophers are the problem, how has that been navigated by film studies scholars?
Yeah, I don't know that should be the outcome of this this roundtable. Philosophers are the problem. Katie, you have your hand up.
Hi, yes. I'm taking notes on all these things. I'm just so struck by many of your observations. I also did my first degree in Introduction, therefore, to Television Studies at Glasgow, where I studied it alongside literature, right? So that was my first comparative analysis of how literature is considered as a value and as arts, as humanities, alongside the super rigorous teaching I got at Glasgow in the 90s, right? And so then I'm prompted by this discussion of philosophy qua philosophy. And I'm reminded that Karen Lurie was talking to us about space in television via Lefebvre, right? So if that's not philosophy, I'm not quite sure what is. So I'm just taking notes on, I'm very interdisciplinary in my own work, and I've brought in the pieces I've written on television, absolutely approaches from beyond TV studies, qua TV studies. But the thing is TV study is very rigorous in my experience, because I look at radio studies and talk about niche, right? But I also look at anthropology in recent times. I look at literature, qua literature, sociology, because I'm in a sociology school. And I'm making a little list here of, I mean, when we're teaching television, when we're writing about it, when we're analyzing it, what are we talking about? What are we using television to talk about? And so many things that you guys are all referencing that I have experience of too, right? So we're talking about representation. We're talking about television as a space for representation of class, gender, race, right? We're talking about the aesthetics of space. We're talking about time, seriality, the ordinary, the everyday, which is what made television mundane, or as Christine mentioned, maybe grubby, right, back in the day. And maybe that goes to its older sense of being less than, right? Because it's everyday, which veers dangerously close to the boringness of sociology, which is not art, right? So humanities is high art and sociology is just like, you know, not art. So therefore those objects are not taken as seriously. But we're also talking about narrative. We're talking about construction, things that do come out of literary theory. We're talking about seriality. We're talking about fans. We're talking about affordances now with all these platforms. And, you know, I just feel like television studies must be, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, this hugely robust, multifaceted set of critical approaches to enable us to talk about all these things. And I guess that's all I have to say in a way. I'm reminded when I've presented on TV if you present at US conferences, SCMS and MLA, which sounds terrifying, which I've never been to, but they foreground these humanities. A lot of people, good people talking about TV, came from humanities departments in the US. And that might speak to the kind of way that TV analysis comes out differently in North America. And hopefully I didn't make too much of hames of my notes, but I just think this is an interesting discussion, so that's my 2 cents.
Can I thank you, Katie? Can I ask a follow-up to that? I was wondering whether, because you said then about all the multiple things TV studies does, might that be the problem kind of perceived externally, that it does too much? Is that, and I'm asking that again, kind of in devil's advocate way, is that part of the issue, that there's a million things we're doing, so actually it's hard for somebody from the outside to understand what TV studies might be? I don't know if that's true. It's just interesting that you listed all of that stuff.
Well, then that's their problem. That's what it is to be robust. But also, if we're being functional, if we're thinking about the ref and all those pressures, and honestly, it's a thing if you're writing about TV and TV textuality. When I was earlier in my career, it's like, oh, what do I need to get money for? I don't actually need money to do my research. I can do it anyway. So you have to manufacture the thing, right? But maybe television's wide spaces for research. I was so struck by Kathy, I'm blanking on her last name, which is ridiculous. You know her, that wonderful television, Johnson, right? Yeah, this study that she just did on COVID viewing, and that just resonated both personally with my experience, but with what I'm getting from my students. So that's a smart, well, it's beyond smart. It was a wonderful piece that she presented on how do we deploy what television can do. You know what I mean? So use that breadth. But anyway, I'm on my preacher hat now. I'll stop. Too much coffee.
It's fine. Thank you. Thank you for that. Amy, you have your hand up.
I didn't mean to have that up. Sorry.
Okay. Well, you did, so you have to say something now. It's fine. Well, unless I'm fine to move on if you don't have something to say.
Yes, no, I can't think of anything right. I'm thrown now. You'll have to move on.
Yeah. Well, actually, because I'm aware of the time, and we've sort of started talking about it, but we should move on to the kind of final question, which is like the productive one, which is, okay, what do we do? What do we do kind of, collectively, individually? Can we kind of resolve this problem? And it does sound like we're all experiencing roughly the same kind of thing. And actually, we've all come out with similar diagnoses as well. So we kind of see where the problem is. And I'm also assuming this isn't a relatively new thing. This has been going on for some time. It's not a sudden. So I think it might have a kind of new inflection because of quality television and so on. That has kind of caused a particular set of things. But what do we do, Rachel? Oh, Kim's put her hand up. Don't say anything, Rachel. Let's go to Kim. Sorry.
No. I'm going to ask a question because we've got Christine here, and I'm always struck when I go back to like the cultural studies, working on soap opera. I think it was Charlotte that said, actually, at the Birmingham school, everyone was studying the news. It was all about this male-dominated. It's all very serious. We've got to take this all very seriously. And it was Charlotte that said, no, actually, probably we should be looking at soap opera because that's what everybody watches. So, Christine, I think probably can speak to this a bit better than me because I think you've been doing this for longer.
Well, obviously, Birmingham was hugely important, but actually, when I started, it was the BFI and Society for Education in Film and Television, and my own, my first essay on Coronation Street was heavily influenced, insofar as influenced by anything, by theories of narrative, which I'm still really interested in. So I think it's possible to overplay the Birmingham cultural studies input. But the thing I would say, following on from that and following on from what you said earlier on, Kim, there is a period in television studies which goes from about, I think it's the 80s, where virtually everything that was happening in television studies was through feminism. It was like, I think John Fiske or John Hartley, one of those Johns, sort of said, well, you could write history, you write about television studies, and what you mean is feminist television studies, because it was soap opera, it was Cagney and Lacey, it was women on the news, etc., etc. So it's a really interesting period that, and then it sort of slipped away, and other things came in, which was fine, obviously. It does occur to me, actually, ELCA, Critical Studies in Television, now has these aerial reviews of different national histories of studying television, which sound really dull, but are actually completely fascinating. And we've certainly had Greece, we've had Czech, I think, have we had the Netherlands, Elke? Can't remember, it's due. Now, in a way, the thing I would in a way like to propose, if perhaps something can be written and we could do a dossier for some journal or other that, you know, in the field, that there might be something about trying to define television studies sort of in different, building on that, those discussions of national context of television studies, and actually trying to define it a bit as a discipline, and giving ourselves a kind of weaponize, I hate that Tory term, but giving ourselves a better understanding of where we came, and no, it's not even an understanding, an interest in the range of television studies and being proud about that, which is why we do get pissed off when all they want to talk about is The Wire and Sopranos and all the rest of them. And Kim, I think you experienced that as much as anyone because you did that work, you know. So I think something, if people are interested, they could look at these studies in Critical Studies in Television of different nations' television studies, and then think about, from your own position, what would you talk about your own television studies as? You know, and there might be some writing or blogs or whatever that could come from that. But there are some examples of people writing about that.
Go ahead, Kim, in response to that, and then I'll come to Elke if you're responding to Christy.
Yeah, I'm just going to respond quickly. There's also, we've had this wonderful series of on CST Online, the RYA blogs for children's television in the Netherlands, which has been just, I thought, wonderful. And I've got Catherine's got something coming up, and you know, the Akria staff. And you know, I'm kind of always aware that I've been running this for 10 years now. We've got a wealth of blogs that I actually could go back over and kind of talk about this kind of thing. I'm really aware that, you know, they're on, and you know, again, online, they're not refereed, although they're all edited. But it is, again, it's kind of the arse end of academia because I'm doing it online. But it might be an idea now to kind of bring it and make it hard copy, and it really is a living history of how television studies scholars have looked at television, and it's not just American, it's British, it's, you know, Germany. There's so much there. It's amazing. So that might be useful for people to do. I don't know.
Okay, thanks, Kim. Elke, you had your hand up.
You might want to go to Anya first. I can wait.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go Anya.
Hi. As a Hispanist who's gone from popular fiction to film to television studies, I really like Christine's idea, and I think Kim was echoing that, of doing some publication on a transnational level, because and I think, and I agree with everything that's been said before. I think it's about the currency that the different disciplines have, isn't it? And modern languages, we all have an inferiority complex. And wherever you go, you will always find somebody who has a similar inferiority complex, partly because of the perception of the discipline, and partly how the institution is run. That can also have an influence on it. Be that as it may, I think if we could come together as a community of TV scholars and do something on transnationality, something big, something groundbreaking, I'd love to contribute to that.
That sounds great. I suppose, again, I'm going to do the devil's advocate. Part of my worry about that, I think that's a great idea, but our concern is about people in other fields not kind of valuing us. And in effect, loads of that work exists already, and the problem is those other people don't read it. So I worry that, you know, there's something we need to do about to convince all of them, and we can make amazing, useful, convincing publications, and then we're going to probably be the people who read them. And so there's this question of how do we get out there?
Yeah, no, totally good point. So to come back to a very capitalist notion of the product, what does the product have to be so that it's groundbreaking? And I mean, I'm just thinking aloud. Is a groundbreaking book, does that have more weight than single journal articles all over the place? I don't know, maybe. The other thing to think about in terms of impact as well, I think we will all have to do more impact activities. And I wonder if we could, because television studies lends itself to that, I think. And I wonder if we could do something in terms of a groundbreaking book, a series of impact events, and so on and so forth. It's really just sort of, I'm throwing ideas out in the open, and, you know, wherever we get the mass, critical mass, that's what we'll do.
Yeah, no, so I mean, I wasn't intending to kind of, like, you know, disregard any ideas. It's just kind of...
No, I know you're not, Brett. I know you're not.
Okay. That's good. Elka, sorry, you've been waiting for some time with your hand up.
Yeah, so I think one of the problems I continue to think we will have is that television itself is also a medium that is so diverse, isn't it? And the people that now look at television and are disregarding television studies are people who are largely looking at the quite masculinized quality television. And yes, there is obviously quite a lot written about that by television scholars. I mean, Kim is in the room, for example. Yes, but and obviously, you know, the quality debate has raged for, well, there was quite a significant debate around that years ago already. But the thing that strikes me is if we want to convince the people, and we would take a product approach, we would have to talk to them about precisely that masculinized television, but that makes and renders the television that is more feminized, again, very, very invisible. And precisely the television that Katie was talking about, the television that is very mundane, that is very everyday. And one of the wonderful things about this conference was precisely how many people were talking about soap operas, you know, gossip shows. Fabulous. And I think finding a way to communicate the complexity of television at the same time as the complexity of television studies, I'm sorry to say, I think it's an impossible task. I think critical studies in television as a journal and all that connects to it has been really instrumental in actually showcasing what television studies is already. But what else can we do? We're doing so much already.
Kim, you have your hand up.
This is really embarrassing. I've forgotten what I was going to say. I was gonna come back with and agree with Elka on something, but it's just gone completely out of my head. I'm so sorry.
All of us, Kim.
I'll go to Rachel if you
yeah, please
remember.
do.
Yeah, Kim will remember what she's going to say while I'm saying this. I was just going to respond to Elka when you say, you know, what do we need to do? And I think, you know, going back to my initial anger reaction, the ERC funding was the thing that really got my goat. Just in terms of the fact that, you know, I'm constantly talking with colleagues who've put in bids for television projects, historical television projects, for example, nationally specific projects sometimes, which just don't get the funding. And actually what we need to do is get the money. And, you know, just going back to, I think it's what you were saying, Katie, a few minutes ago, that, you know, you realise you didn't really need the money to do the research that we do, which we, you know, we do and we don't. But we kind of need a big grant that will give us that visibility. And it seems to me that the best way to do that is to bid for a large transnational grant. And
can I be on the team, Rachel?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think we all need to be on the team.
Absolutely,
don't we?
yeah, absolutely. I totally agree.
I think that's one, it's just one suggestion, and I know it's given us additional work, but it is something that we all have to do for our jobs anyway. We need to be trying to get that money. And yeah, so if anyone wants to kind of think about that with us at a later point, I'm sure we'd all be up for having that conversation, because I do think that's one of the ways that we can make ourselves more visible.
Okay, that's a great suggestion. Kim, did you remember, or have you not?
Yeah, no, I did. But it's like, I'm so angry. To prepare for this, I went back over the philosophy awful journal, and I noticed there was the one article about new television. Oh, so Rachel's absolutely, I mean, everyone's outraged.
1990s onwards.
1992 onwards. And, you know, I mean, I know I've in my work, I've privileged American TV, and, you know, we've called it quality TV, and it's such a kind of, you know, what do you call it, this new TV? You know, we don't know, but it isn't new. That's the point. It's not new. It's got this whole heritage of soap opera, of, you know, the primetime soap. It's all there. You know, you can see the sitcom in there coming through. It's, you know, so that's the arrogance that drives me mad, is that it's not just about the existence of a canon that people are ignoring. And I sometimes think maybe that in order to, they just don't acknowledge that this exists, in order to say, look, we've just discovered new TV. It's wonderful. It's a new thing. You know, Elka, really go and read it. It'll just drive you mad. You'll just go, you know, I've read it before, and reading it again, I'm even more angry, because it does feel like it's something that is just from nowhere and has got no debt to anything that came before. And I think that's the real thing that gets to me, is there's this whole history of TV that you've just totally ignored. Yeah, rant over.
Okay, that's fine. Katie, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just in terms of maybe thinking about how to access funding, and Katrin just put in something in terms of a Trojan horse, right? How do we mobilize what we actually want to do, which is what you do with a grant, right? You decide what you want to do and then figure out how to put it in grant-friendly language, right? But, and this is my particular thing, so I appreciate not everyone's into it, but what if we did pedagogy, teaching TV? Because that goes to impact. Our institutions will be all happy. It re-legitimates TV, because students, from my experience, love TV, even if they don't call it TV. But it might be a way to frame that research. It will depend on what kind of research you want to do. I was always a textual analysis person. I looked engaging with the text. So studying pedagogy is a different thing, but we can also maybe study textual properties via teaching. So it might be a way to go. That's all.
Yeah, and I'm mindful of what you're kind of suggesting there, that kind of just deciding to do a collective grant is not a good idea. There has to be kind of a genuine topic, and then work out from that. Elka, you've put about producing a funding call out of this panel. Do you want to talk about, you put that in the chat?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, we are here all talking to each other and all agreeing with each other that this really needs to be addressed, and we don't know how to address it. Well, that's a research question, isn't it? So we might as well, we could move that forward, basically. Yeah.
We're going to write a really angry grant application. It's all in capital letters. So yeah, but it's thinking about the topic, and maybe the discussion, Karen, afterwards. Katie suggested education and pedagogy there. And I get the logic there of isn't it Catherine who put in the chat about, as you say, a Trojan horse? So is there a kind of route where you can use a set of language or a subject which is seen as kind of more legitimate to get in? Rachel, your hand's up.
I think Kim was first. Was yours an old hand, Kim?
I thought Kim's was a legacy hand.
Oh, was it? I'm sorry. I was just going to say a little bit about the closing day of the Television Aesthetics Conference last week, and I must confess that I did only go to the last day, the second day of it. But it was an interesting one because and Richard, who's here, was also there. And Richard, feel free to please jump in and give your views on it as well. But it was very interesting because the final keynote was a colleague whose work I wasn't familiar with, who was not writing from a television studies perspective, I don't think, who was writing about why, why we're engaged, who was talking about why we're engaged with character in long form serial drama. But again, there was like kind of in a void, if you like. And that was a keynote. And then there was John Ellis after that, who gave this utterly brilliant, self-reflexive commentary on visible fictions, what he thought its original contributions were, what the problems with those contributions now are in a changed landscape of television. He's utterly fantastic, not the keynote, right, which was odd. And then the round table, somebody in the audience did actually raise the issue of this journal of open philosophy, which I think was a kind of polite way of suggesting that there was a kind of lack of acknowledgement in some of the papers that had been given, that there's quite a lot of work in television aesthetics already. And the conference was sponsored by, Richard, is this right? The British Society for Aesthetics, the British Society of Aesthetics. So you've got this kind of organisation which is extremely well, it's at the top of its kind of the hierarchy, isn't it? The British Society of Aesthetics. And again, what you've got is they're supporting a conference where it's about television aesthetics, which was being presented partly, not as much as with this journal issue, as something newly recognised. And even though this discussion has been incredibly stimulating and interesting, I still don't feel that we've got to the heart of what we can do to change this. It's to do with the change of status, because with status comes power, and with power comes visibility. And how are we going to alter that? I mean, the reason we're getting all of the things that are making us so angry is because the status of television and culture has changed with the advent of streaming, with the kind of global colonization by US masculinist quality television, if you like. And that has changed the status of television and made it available and accessible for other disciplines to pick up and run with. So those of us, including myself, who've been writing about cheap television, Brett, and arguing for its value, like that is not the television that's being picked up and written about in a historical way. So I don't know, I'm just ranting again, quite frankly. I haven't really got anything to say other than I really feel very, very strongly that we need to do something positive coming out of this together as a kind of collegial group effort.
I'm aware we've got 4 minutes left to work it out. So there's clearly a desire to kind of do something sort of collective. I mean, I know, Elke, you mentioned so CST might be interested in a dossier. When we spoke to Karen Lurie about this panel, she said Screen would be as well. I think those would be really useful things to do, though again, I'm kind of mindful of what I said earlier, that we're in effect talking to people who already agree with us. That's kind of, and I'm noting Josie's comment earlier about whether we need to kind of very proactively publish in non-television studies journals and take ourselves out in other kinds of places. You've specifically put philosophy journals there, as we've clearly decided that's the problem. Yeah, I do feel, actually, given what you've just said, and I'm aware time is running out, Michael Clark's just put there, I helped to organise a television aesthetics conference I can explain. Do you want to say something, Michael? That would be really useful.
Right, I think you can hear me now. Hello, yes. I guess on the John Ellis situation, I can explain that. He actually just submitted a call for papers. Like, he just flat out he lives down the road. He was in the University of Kent. He lives in Whitstable. He just submitted a 20-minute paper. We gave him an hour because he's John Ellis. But part of the issue is, so we had Jason Mittel as a keynote as well, and part of the BSA's policy is that for keynotes, you need to have gender parity. So we had Jason Mittel down from about 2020 as a keynote. I mean, it happened last week, but it was like it was going to be a pre-pandemic conference, and then pandemic happened. And we wanted to keep it in person because rather than go online, because we wanted to get philosophers and TE scholars in a room to have these conversations. Now, that I think the conference was a success to a point, but we didn't get the philosophers in, really, apart from one of the keynotes, Iris Vidmar-Jokanovic. So one of the issues was we needed a female philosopher who had written about television. There aren't many. There's Iris Vidmar-Jokanovic, there is Anne Eaton, Sarah Cardwell as well. She was going to be a keynote, but she had to drop out, sadly. And I wonder if we had Sarah Cardwell, whether, I guess, the historical lineage would have made more sense, because the conference was television aesthetics. Now what? When we put the proposal together, the television aesthetics was kind of a reference to her paper, television aesthetics. So it would have made a lot more sense, but sadly, it didn't come together. I guess this is just the problems of organising a conference, and especially organising a conference at the moment. But the papers we had were mostly of a kind of television aesthetics, I guess the kind of burgeoning television aesthetics mindset, which is more related to film studies, related to I guess the movement, well, not movement, but the tradition that's sort of grown in the last sort of 20, 25, 30 odd years. Yeah, I'm sort of rambling now, and I'm also aware of time. So, but at least with the keynotes, I hope that kind of explains. And also with the BSA, so University of Kent is, I guess, unique in the sense that it has an aesthetics research centre. We have close ties with the BSA, to the point where they kind of stopped us applying for too many grants. But I think, yeah, part of the rationale was, how with that institutional allegiance with the BSA, how can we move these conversations forward? How can we bring TV studies into aesthetics, kind of? And I don't know how successful the conference was in that regard, but at least that was the intention.
That's really useful, Michael. Thank you, because it also indicates, I mean, what we've talked a lot about interdisciplinarity and how we're kind of understood by other subject areas, and what you're indicating there actually is, those structural systems that kind of can get in the way of that, and a thing you might want to achieve sort of ends up not necessarily happening. And also the really interesting thing you said there, if I heard you right, that the intention was to get philosophers and television studies people in the room, but not many philosophers came.
Pretty much, yeah.
So this interesting thing that even when a space like that is offered, it ends up being television.
Yeah, and we attack the various mailing lists, not just BAFTs, but BSAs, various philosophy mailing lists as well. And a couple of philosophers turned up, and they, it was a really constructive conversation. But I guess there's also the case, we are doing an in-person conference, a mostly in-person conference while the pandemic is still going on, so that I think maybe also limited things generally, but yeah, it's what it is.
Yeah, no, it's useful to know those kind of complications that we're engaging with, and that we know that this stuff isn't simple. But over time, so I kind of need to stop, but I don't know that I feel like we've come to a hooray, here's what we're going to go and do next. But there's clearly a desire to do something, and if nothing else, hopefully this session was useful in us discovering that we're all encountering similar problems, and so where we might now and again encounter this individually and feel, oh, is this only happening where I work, or is it only happening with these colleagues? It's useful at least to discover this is happening in lots of places, and so hopefully we can kind of find some way to kind of, whether that's grants, whether that's publications, whether that's the book series that was kind of talked about, whatever that might be, we can think about something kind of productive to do. But yeah, I guess we better finish, just because, but I'm fine to carry on chatting for a bit. I'm just aware that it's past, so we kind of need to formally sort of end. So can everyone who's here join me in thanking Josie, Kim, Rachel, Amy, who had to go, and Christine, who had to go. So thank you to all of them. I've really enjoyed that discussion, and it's a really nice way to kind of finish the conference off. I'm going to pass back to Elke, being it's the end of the conference, but on behalf of everybody, I'm sure Elke's going to kind of thank people who've organised the conference, but I think we should all thank the spectacular Elke, who's organised, emailed, attended stuff, done a gazillion things, as she always does with this conference. So I personally want to say thanks so much, Elke, but I'm sure everybody does as well. It's been brilliant, and in person next year, so we can hopefully get back to that as well. Elke, I'll pass back to you to close the conference. Can't hear you. Can't hear you, Elke. No. Have you already closed the conference? You've turned your microphone. It's like I'm done. I'm off. No, I can't hear you. You might have to type a farewell in the chat. No. Oh, this is a beautiful way to end an online.
And what about now?
Yes.
Yes.
We can hear you.
It was just my thing had come out. Sorry for that. Yeah, this is a beautiful way of ending the conference. I wanted to say thank you for everyone for attending, for your contributions, for the chairs in particular for chairing, because having someone else chairing sessions has been massively helpful, to be honest. But also to Gemma Hardy, who has helped me with the organization in the background. So thank you all very much. And can I also just say thank you to the Television Studies Research Group at Edgehill University, who have over the years provided me with a significant sense of belonging, and that television studies absolutely rocks. So there you go. So have a lovely time, and we hope to see you next year. Until then, take care.
Thanks everybody very much.
Elke, that sounded like the end of a television program then. That sounded like children's television.